When we get back to the study of Genesis, we find ourselves at a place that you anticipate when you're studying the book of Genesis, and that's the beginning of chapter 12, because here you begin the story of Abram and the family that will come from him, and the Jews, and the following of the seed that will eventually produce the Messiah. The promise has been made ever since Genesis chapter 3, but now the family comes into view that will eventually produce the one that will save the world from its sin. And so that's important to us. It's also important to Abram because now he is going to follow God's commands on faith. He's going to be building his faith. We're going to see him in this chapter, in chapter 12, really lacking in that faith. But he's going to be building that faith so that God can use him as he has designed his place to be. And so you get to Genesis 12, and the first thing that you read is the great overlooking promise that God makes to Abram about his future and also about his, when you think about it, his present security. Because the things that Abram needs to fulfill this promise, he doesn't have yet. He doesn't have a son. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But listen to this promise as we begin Genesis chapter 12. And the Lord has said to Abram, get out of your country, from your kindred, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. The very first thing that God says to Abram is, it's time to get out of your country. He may have said this as early as the time when he was in his homeland of Ur. The story that we find in Genesis 12 centers on their presence 600 miles to the northwest of that in a place called Haran. And they have obviously uprooted from Ur. The promise, the command may have come early for them to do that initially, though not detailed really, although it says here he had said to Abram about this. And so it's very likely that it was first given in Ur. Now it seems to be repeated as he has been in Haran for some time. We don't know how long. We know that the process of time, that it seems one of the main things is that his father, Terah, will die in Haran, thus in some sense passing on this patriarchy, in other words, to his son. And his son Abraham, or Abram, is the one now that is receiving this promise. And it's time again to leave the family. And he will leave a good part of his family because he has a brother there named Nahor. And that brother will stay in Haran. We see him later on when this family is looking for wives like Rebekah and Rachel. They will return or send someone to this place back to Nahor, to the family, in order to find the suitable wife for these sons. And so Nahor will stay there. Accompanying Abram is Lot, who is the son of the other brother that is called, coincidentally, Haran. And he has died as early as Ur before they left there. And so now Lot is the nephew of Abram and has somewhat apparently attached himself to Abram and is under his family, you might say. And so when they leave Haran, Lot goes with him and all that he has. And so verse 4, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarah his wife and Lot his brother's son and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran. And they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. that's somewhere in the neighborhood of a 400 to 500 mile trip. It's thought to be about 600 miles from Ur to the place of Haran. Now they make another large step. Takes a long time to get there, and they take everything. This is a one-way ticket. They're not planning on coming back. This is going to find a land that God is promising to them, a land that he will show him. And we'll see before this chapter is even over that he will promise that land to Abram and to his family. But as we said, Abram is 75 years old when he leaves Haran, and that's about 26 years before Isaac will ever come on the scene as his son. And so at this point, he has no children. And yet he hears God promises that really demand a family and a long future of a family. And the blessing of whoever blesses you, I will bless. Whoever curses you, I will curse. It is also a promise of protection in order for that to be ensured that the time can come and is needed to produce all of this seed and all of this family. Just want to pay attention to that inclusion of that as we hear this promise given directly from God to Abram, because as this chapter progresses, we'll see that he's not ready to put his full weight down on that insurance, on his safety, on his future. And we'll see that as we go forward. As he gets to Canaan, there are a couple of places that are mentioned. By the way, Abram's name means eternal father, or exalted father, not eternal, but exalted father. He's not even the father of one yet, but his name already means exalted father, 26 years before he even becomes a father at all. So this promise, though, is putting that into God's hands, and God says this will happen. So verse 6, Abram passed through the land, this is Canaan now, they've arrived, to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh. And the Canaanites were then in the land. Shechem is probably not a named place at this time, but by the time this is written, that's the location and how it's identified. So he comes to this place that will play a role later on in the story of Abraham and his family. And at this place, this first significant stopping place, it seems, in Canaan, you immediately hear from God again, and especially Abram hears from God again. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So it's very specific. He has arrived at what God said is the land that I will show you. Now he has not only shown it to him, he has promised it to him as his possession. It is something that will come into the possession of the family of Abraham. Well, he doesn't stay in that particular place, but he does build an altar to Jehovah who had appeared to him. The first altar that is built in this land of Canaan, built by Abram. Then in verse 6, and he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord, or called on the name of Jehovah. So again, a significant spot, this time a high place, but he builds another altar. It is already in Abram's understanding is his relationship to God, his dependence. And that's what an altar really represents. An altar is a place where you offer a sacrifice, where you say to God by that sacrifice of giving something that God has given him, in returning it, instead of using it, you might say, for food, he returns it to God with this concept that you make this sacrifice acknowledging that what you have comes from God. So that's a good thing. And the building of these altars are important. But we'll also see that this falls short of the faith that you really come to depend for everything on God. And so that's going to be what he finds out as he goes a little further south. He's going to keep going, apparently because of a need. He has flocks, he has livestock that has to be fed. This troop that he is with is not going to be easily accepted by those who are in the place and using the resources. And so he just hasn't found that supply that he needs. And so in verse 9, so Abraham journeyed, going out still toward the south. But there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. We'll see this again when Jacob comes along with his family, and there's a great famine in the land, and they go to Egypt because there seems to be always this last opportunity, this last place that still has resources and supplies, and it's Egypt, primarily because of the Nile River, because of that being the nearest of those kind of places where it is often referred to as the Nile Delta, where it is still has water because of that great river, and because there they can continue to have grain, and that it takes a long time. They're provided for abundantly, and they can be seen as a place where others will go. And this is the first we see this. It's interesting the parallels that we find here about Egypt and the relationship it has with Abraham and his family. It starts this early, and so he's going to go there. But some of the other parallels, you might say, are not so good as we continue the story in this chapter, because he knows that Egypt is highly civilized and a lot of people and powerful. He is now going to do something out of fear for his continuation of life. That's why this is so significant, considering the promise that he's just been given by God about the fact that if the promises of God are going to be fulfilled, Abram will have to live quite some time and produce the family that is enabled to then produce this great nation and be a blessing to the whole world. So that's the situation between the promise and the present circumstances, that Abram is not quite ready to make that connection. And so he does something else. In verse 11, it came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, "Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance." Regardless of her age, it is apparent that Sarai at this point was an extremely beautiful woman, be given the kind of attention that creates a problem or a worry for Abraham. And so she is that striking. And it happens just that way. He's not wrong in the attention that she will garner from the Egyptians. He says, "But therefore it will happen when the Egyptians see you, that they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live." He says this is what's probably going to happen. And that's exactly the problem of the lack of faith, given the promise that God has just made. The promise demands that he survive. He is now saying, my life is going to be cut short right here. If we go into Egypt, we have to go find supplies. We have to go where the famine takes us, but I'm in grave danger of losing my life. So he doesn't connect that promise to this reality of present day for him. And that's the real crux of faith, is to bring the promise of God into the reality of the present life. And that's why Hebrews 11 verse 1 will say that that faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen, meaning that faith takes and makes a substantive change according to what is promised. That things you can't see yet, you will give evidence in your life that those things will happen. Well, Abram is not doing that on this occasion. Abram is acting like the promise just is not going to be fulfilled. Otherwise, he could just trust God and and not worry about the Egyptians taking his life. But he does. And so he tells Sarai this, please say that you're my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. He asks a great deal, and Sarai will be taken into the house of Pharaoh, and that with the future prospect of becoming one of his wives, part of his harem, because that's why she's been taken. And so it puts her at great risk if she were to somehow acquire the hatred of Pharaoh for refusing him or something of that nature. Her life could be at risk. Or if she doesn't, obviously that too is a problem with her being a married woman. And so he puts Sarai at great risk. He says, for your sake, as if her survival is going to be a blessing for her, that she has enabled Abram to survive. Given the circumstance, that's pretty weak rationale. But also he says that it may be, I may live because of you. He has placed himself, his safety, his security, over that of Sarai, and he will continue. We don't know how long, but he will continue in that. He will go to bed at night and sleep while his wife is in the house of Pharaoh. And while even in that, he's being blessed because of that. And that too would work on the terms of guilt and shame as to how this is coming about. And so, verse 14, it was when Abram came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. And the princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. So she is that striking. They do not even try to take her for themselves. They commend her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. And because of that, look what he does for Abram. He treated Abram well for her sake, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. So Abram's getting rich because his wife has been greatly prized by Pharaoh and taken by Pharaoh. But Pharaoh has not done anything physical with Sarah because God is protecting Sarah. Abram's not, but God is. And that just shows you how God will work to fulfill his promise using flawed people that are not doing what they ought to be doing, and still his will be done. And so he preserves the safety and the purity of the wife, Sarai. So in verse 17, we find out how. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh. Pharaoh is also plagued, and his house, with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So the 10 plagues that God sends on Egypt when he's going to deliver the people out of bondage are not the first plagues that the Egyptians have received from Jehovah. Here are the first ones that we know of, that he sends great plagues, it says, against Pharaoh and his people because he has a married woman in his household. And it becomes apparent to Pharaoh that is the key. That's the problem. Whether he figures that out or is revealed to him by God, he now knows there is the problem. And so he approaches and confronts Abram about that, verse 18. And one of the 2 times that this happens, both times, a foreigner, someone who's not expected to have integrity, a foreigner really has more integrity than Abram himself. So he reprimands Abram about what he's done. Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say," and here's where we find out that it actually had been said. "Why did you say, 'She is my sister'? I might have taken her as my wife. Now, therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way." We'll find out the second time that this happens in Genesis chapter 20, that on a technicality, Sarai is Abram's half-sister. They're both the children of Terah, but she has a different mother, so they are half sister and brother. And so that's a technicality, you might say, and it's a bit of truth thrown in with the intent to deceive, because obviously the point is she's my sister, not my wife. He doesn't have to say that, but it's implied, and that's why Pharaoh would take her. And so Pharaoh does, but he says, why didn't you say she was your wife? He uncovers the deception, and Abram, his excuse of, well, she is my sister, we know that he brought that up with Abimelech in Genesis chapter 20, but by that time that's a pretty weak excuse, and probably something that even to Abram doesn't sound good coming out of his mouth. I tricked you. I told you what you wanted to hear and not what was really the full truth, and so I tricked you. And so there's no getting around that this is a lie, and it is a shame, it is a guilt on Abram's part. And Pharaoh says, take your wife and get out. Leave, you have done me great harm. Verse 20, Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So the command to the men, the only thing that we can surmise from that is, don't harm them, but make sure they leave. They're leaving, but don't harm them. So even in that, God is still extending his protection. He has protected Abram. He has blessed Abram with great blessing. Through this, he has become more supplied and having enrichment through this incident. It's not that he's blessing the actions of Abram, but he's blessing the man that he has said he will bless. And Abram now goes with a wife that has not been compromised. They're safely, you might say, escorted out, and God has preserved what he has said he will preserve. God does keep his promise. The problem with Abram was he did not connect the promise that is overriding and goes to the far future, even in the term that Abram would understand, the great nation. That has to be down the road. And through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. This is a long-term covenant, a long-term promise. But he hasn't connected that to tomorrow or today. He hasn't said, well, I know that I will not be put to death in Egypt, because that would stop the whole purpose of God's promise. He wouldn't be able to keep that. If he lets me die in Egypt, then the promise is broken. And so God cannot let him die in Egypt in this point, but he doesn't make that connection. And I wonder, as we have faith and we know that we are to be a children of faith, live our lives by faith, that our faith should be substantially viewed in terms of what we hope for, a faith that gives evidence in the things that we do about things that are not yet seen. They should be seen in our lives. That's what faith does. Faith is real. It acts knowing that the promise will be fulfilled, knowing that God keeps his promise. If God says you believe this and you repent and you are baptized in the name of Christ and your sins will be washed away, you do that based on that word and you connect it to your present activity, you obey. And so on it goes through all the promises of God. And the challenge of faith and the reality of faith is connect the promise of God and all that that means and all that it must ensure for our lives, and connect that to what I do today. And that you don't do anything to help God, to ensure that God will find them, because that's what Abram's doing. He's saying, well, God's going to need my help, even a deception, to keep things going in order for that to happen between me and my wife. But God didn't need that.